Working as a night clerk in a roadside motel was never my dream, but it was what I had left after losing my previous job. The motel where I worked was in the city of Canterbury, a place surrounded by mysteries and dark stories. On that particular night, something really terrifying happened. Something that changed my life forever. I've never been a superstitious person, but after what I've experienced, it's impossible not to believe that there are things beyond our comprehension. I started my shift as usual, checking the registers and tidying up the reception area. It was a cold, silent night, typical of that mountainous region. At around 11 in the evening, a young woman hurried into the lobby. She seemed to be running away from something or someone. Elizabeth, as she called herself, looked troubled and desperate. Her eyes were wide and she had strange marks on her arms, as if she had been scratched by something. When she asked for a room, I noticed that her hands were shaking. I registered and handed over the key, trying to ignore the bad feeling I'd had since she arrived. Elizabeth took the key in a hurry and headed for the room at the end of the corridor. Something about her behavior made me uneasy, but I preferred not to ask questions. After all, I'd seen everything in that place and knew that it was often best not to get involved in guests' problems. A short while later, while I was going through the records, I began to hear strange sounds coming from Elizabeth's room. They were low whispers, as if someone was talking to her. I got up from my chair and went to the door to try to hear better. The lights in the hallway began to flicker, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I decided I was imagining things and went back to reception. However, the sounds continued, and I couldn't get Elizabeth out of my head. With each passing minute, the feeling that something very wrong was happening intensified. Finally, I couldn't stand it any longer and went up to her room. As I approached, I heard Elizabeth speaking in a language I couldn't identify. The whispers were incessant and almost hypnotic. It was then that Elizabeth suddenly came out of her room, as if she was being chased by something invisible. She seemed even more frightened than before, and her voice trembling. She told me that she was being followed by an entity. Her story seemed surreal, but the look on her face convinced me that she believed every word she said. I felt a mixture of fear and responsibility. I had to help her somehow, but I didn't know what to do. I convinced Elizabeth to go back to her room and rest while I thought of a solution. From that moment on, the night became a real nightmare. Little did I know that I was about to face the purest and most inexplicable terror of my life. After Elizabeth went back to her room, I thought the night would finally be quiet. However, the strange sounds continued. I heard whispers and knocks on the walls that made me even more uneasy. It seemed that there was someone else in the room with her, but I knew that was impossible. I checked the security cameras to see if I could figure out what was going on. The images showed only Elizabeth, alone in her room, but there was something strange. The shadows around her seemed to move independently as if they had a life of their own. The feeling that something very wrong was happening intensified. She couldn't ignore the signs. As she tried to find a rational explanation for what she was seeing, the light in the reception area began to flicker. This had never happened before. Fear began to take hold of me, but I knew I had to stay calm in order to help Elizabeth. I decided it was time to investigate more closely. I approached the room again, this time determined to enter if necessary. As I put my hand on the doorknob, I heard Elizabeth speaking again in that unknown language. I opened the door slowly, and what I saw was terrifying. Elizabeth was on the floor, trembling and mumbling incomprehensible words. Her body seemed to be convulsing, and her eyes were rolled back, showing only white. Terror overtook me, but I had to do something. I called Elizabeth's name, trying to get her out of that state, but nothing seemed to work. The sensation of being watched grew stronger, and I felt the presence of something evil in the room. I stood still, not knowing how to act, while Elizabeth continued in her disturbing trance. Finally, she stopped squirming and lay still, breathing hard. I helped her up and put her to bed. Elizabeth woke up disoriented and started crying, begging for help. She told me that she was running away from an entity that had been chasing her for months. With every word she said, I felt the desperation and fear growing inside me. I convinced Elizabeth to try to rest while I thought about what to do. I went back to reception, my mind spinning, trying to find a solution. But one thing was certain. That night was far from over. The terror I felt was only the beginning, and I knew that something much worse was to come. Shortly after trying to calm Elizabeth down, she abruptly left the room. Her eyes were full of fear, and she looked even more upset than before. I couldn't help asking her what was going on. It was then that she started talking about the entity that was following her. Elizabeth told me that for months she had been haunted by an invisible force. At first, it was just small things, noises at night, objects moving on their own. But over time, the manifestations became more intense and frightening. She said that the entity seemed to feed on her fear, getting stronger and stronger. As she spoke, I could see the anguish in her eyes. Elizabeth was clearly terrified and desperate for help. I tried to stay calm, but her words made me uneasy. I'd never believed these things, but the way she spoke and the intensity of her fear made me reconsider. I suggested that Elizabeth go back to her room and try to rest, promising that I would keep an eye on everything. She was reluctant, but eventually agreed, exhausted and with no other options. When Elizabeth closed the door, I stood at the reception desk, trying to process everything she had told me. The feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me, and with each passing minute, my fear grew. I decided to look for something that could help me better understand what was going on. In the motel office, I found an old, occult book that someone had left behind. I'd never paid any attention to it, but at that moment it seemed to be my only hope. I started flipping through the pages, looking for something that could explain Elizabeth's experiences and how I could help her. As I read the book, the feeling of dread grew. The stories and rituals described there were disturbing, but somehow they made sense with what Elizabeth had said. I decided that I had to try something, even if it was risky. I couldn't leave Elizabeth alone in that situation. I went back to her room, book in hand, and explained what I had found. Elizabeth looked at me with a mixture of hope and despair. It was clear that she would do anything to get rid of that entity. We decided to try one of the rituals described in the book, in the hope of expelling the evil force that was tormenting her. Little did I know that we were just beginning to plunge into an even deeper nightmare. The words in the book were just a glimpse of the terror that was about to unfold. As Elizabeth tried to rest, the electricity in the motel began to fail. The lights flickered, plunging the place into momentary darkness. Each time this happened, the feeling of dread increased. The silence became heavy, as if the air was charged with an invisible evil presence. I stood at the reception desk, trying to control my fear. I felt a cold, sinister presence around me, something that seemed to be watching my every move. The security cameras showed only static and shadows, as if something was interfering with the electricity. I decided I needed to act before it was too late. I went to Elizabeth's room again. As I approached, the sensation of being watched became more intense. I opened the door slowly and walked in. Elizabeth was lying in bed, apparently asleep, but the atmosphere in the room was suffocating. The air was thick, and I felt as if something invisible was about to manifest itself. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, taking on undefined and threatening shapes. The feeling of dread was almost palpable. I approached Elizabeth and noticed that she was mumbling incomprehensible words in her sleep. Her expression was one of sheer terror, as if she were living a nightmare. I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I picked up the occult book and began to read aloud one of the exorcism rituals. The words were difficult to pronounce, but I continued, feeling the evil presence stirring around me. Elizabeth began to stir, as if she was fighting something in her dreams. Suddenly, she woke up screaming. Her eyes were full of fear and pain. She tried to speak, but the words came out slurred. The invisible force seemed to be trying to control her actions. I continued reading the book, hoping to drive the entity away. The shadows around me became more intense, almost tangible, as if they were taking on a life of their own. The energy in the room was suffocating, and I began to feel a pressure in my chest, making it difficult to breathe. Elizabeth looked at me desperate, and I knew I couldn't stop. I had to finish the ritual, even if I didn't know if it would work. Every word I uttered seemed to irritate the entity more, which was now clearly manifesting itself through the shadows. The night was getting darker and darker, and the feeling that something terrible was about to happen was inescapable. I needed to keep calm and carry on, but fear and despair were growing inside me. We were only just beginning to face the real terror of the night. Elizabeth's screams intensified, and the invisible force in the room seemed to grow in power. Suddenly, her body began to twitch violently, as if it were being pulled by an invisible force. His eyes were rolled back, showing only white, and blood was dripping from his eyes and mouth. It was a horrible and desperate sight. I put the book down for a moment and tried to hold her, but I was pushed against the wall by an invisible force. I hit my head hard, and the impact made me dizzy. When I stood up, I saw that Elizabeth was in a deep trance, her movements erratic and frightening. It was as if the entity was taking complete control of her body. I was terrified, but I knew I had to keep trying. I picked up the book again and began to read aloud, trying to keep my voice steady. Elizabeth began to speak in an unknown language, a mixture of whispers and screams that chilled me to the bone. The shadows in the room seemed to solidify, moving menacingly around us. Elizabeth suddenly stopped squirming and lay still, breathing irregularly. Approaching cautiously, I realized that her eyes were still not normal. Something was deeply wrong, and I knew we needed help. However, in the middle of the night, in an isolated motel, there was no one to turn to. Slowly, Elizabeth came to her senses, crying and begging for help. She looked exhausted, as if she had been fighting an invisible force for hours. Her face was pale, and her hands were shaking. I tried to calm her down, saying that we would do our best to get rid of the entity. It was then that Elizabeth revealed the true horror. She told me that months ago, she had taken part in a summoning ritual that had gone wrong. She and some friends were playing with forces they didn't understand and ended up releasing something evil. Since then, the entity had followed her, making her life a living hell. Her voice was full of regret and fear, and the pain in her eyes was undeniable. The gravity of the situation became clear to me. I knew that the entity was dangerous and that we didn't have much time. I decided that we needed to use the book to perform a more powerful ritual. We needed to expel the entity once and for all, but that meant facing even greater dangers. The presence in the room seemed to intensify, as if it was aware of our plans. Elizabeth and I were exhausted, but we had no other choice. We had to keep fighting, not only for her safety, but also for my own survival. The terror of that night was far from over, and I knew that even worse things were to come. Elizabeth was finally able to speak more clearly, although she was still visibly shaken. Between tears, she recounted how it all began with a group of friends who, out of fun and curiosity, decided to take part in an invocation ritual. At the time, they didn't really believe that anything could happen. They used an occult book, similar to the one I had found, to try to communicate with spirits. At first, it all seemed like a harmless prank. But as they progressed through the ritual, strange things began to happen. Objects moved on their own, and disturbing sounds echoed around them. Elizabeth said they felt a strong, threatening presence, but didn't know how to stop it. When they tried to end the ritual, something went terribly wrong. The entity they had summoned didn't go back where it came from and started chasing them, especially Elizabeth. I listened to every word with a lump in my throat. Elizabeth was being tormented by something she didn't understand, and now, somehow, I was involved too. The gravity of the situation hit me hard, and I knew we would need something very powerful to help. As Elizabeth spoke, I began to leaf through the occult book in search of a stronger ritual that could help us. I knew that to face this entity, we would need courage and a drastic solution. I found a ritual that seemed promising, but also extremely risky. Elizabeth was willing to try anything to get rid of the entity, and I couldn't let her face it alone. I returned to Elizabeth's room with the book, and together we decided to perform the ritual. We knew it could be dangerous, but we had no other choice. Elizabeth's desperation was evident, and the evil presence in the room seemed to intensify, as if the entity knew what we were planning. Elizabeth started convulsing again, and I knew we had to act fast. The shadows around us became even denser, almost tangible. It felt like the room itself was closing in on us, trying to prevent any attempt to free ourselves. I began to recite the words of the ritual, trying to ignore the fear that threatened to paralyze me. Elizabeth was in a trance-like state, her eyes rolled back and her body contorted in a frightening way. It was clear that the entity was struggling to maintain control over her. The words it uttered resounded in the air, charged with an energy I didn't fully understand. The air around us became even heavier, and a feeling of deep dread set in. The shadows began to move menacingly as if they were living creatures. With every word I uttered, it felt like we were disturbing an ancient, evil force that didn't want to be expelled. We knew we couldn't stop, but the fight against the entity was far from over. The terror we felt was only the beginning, and we knew that we would need all our strength and courage to continue facing the evil that surrounded us. With the occult book in my hands, I returned to Elizabeth's room. The feeling of oppression was almost unbearable, as if the air was being sucked out of our lungs. The shadows around us seemed to take on a life of their own, moving in an unsettling and threatening way. Elizabeth was lying on the bed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, muttering incomprehensible words. I knew we had to act quickly before it was too late. I began to recite the ritual from the book, my hands shaking with nervousness. Elizabeth began to convulse violently, as if she were fighting something inside her. Her screams were disturbing, echoing through the room and filling me with a deep fear. The shadows moved more intensely, almost touching us with their evil presence. As I continued to recite the words of the ritual, Elizabeth was thrown from the bed onto the floor. Her body contorted into unnatural positions. It was as if the entity was trying to stop our attempt at exorcism. The situation seemed increasingly desperate, and I began to doubt whether we would be able to expel the demon that was tormenting her. The words of the ritual came out of my mouth with difficulty, but we couldn't stop. Elizabeth began to bleed from her eyes and mouth, and I knew we had to act fast. The sensation of being watched intensified, and I felt the presence of the entity becoming more and more powerful. It felt like the room itself was conspiring against us, trying to prevent any chance of liberation. Elizabeth looked at me with an expression of pure desperation, begging me to continue. The power of the entity was overwhelming, and I knew that any mistake could be fatal. I continued to recite the ritual, my voice steady despite the fear that consumed me. I could feel the negative energy building up around us, as if the entity was about to manifest itself physically. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating, and I began to feel a pressure in my chest that made it difficult to breathe. Elizabeth was clearly in agony, and with each passing second, the feeling of dread increased. The shadows around us became almost tangible, moving with an evil intent. Finally, I finished the ritual, hoping that this would be enough to expel the entity. Elizabeth fell to the ground, exhausted and bleeding, but still alive. The sense of evil presence began to subside, but I knew we weren't completely safe. The ritual seemed to have weakened the entity, but not eliminated it completely. The fight was far from over, and the feeling of imminent danger didn't go away. Elizabeth and I were exhausted, but we couldn't afford to rest. We had to keep fighting in any way possible to get rid of the entity that was still threatening us. The situation got worse when Elizabeth started hurting herself again. She scratched her arms, banged her head against the wall, and screamed in pain and despair. It seemed that the entity was redoubling its efforts to regain control. I felt powerless, not knowing how to stop this self-destruction. The negative energy in the room was almost tangible, and I began to doubt my abilities. I felt guilty for not being able to protect Elizabeth. With every move she made, the dread grew inside me. I tried to think of something, anything that could help, but my mind was clouded by fear. Desperate, I scoured the occult book in search of something else we could try. But as I read, the feeling that we were being watched intensified. I felt the entity's presence growing stronger and stronger, as if it was waiting for the right moment to strike. Elizabeth continued to hurt herself, her screams echoing around the room and filling me with a deep despair. The air in the room was suffocating, and I began to feel a pressure in my chest that made it difficult to breathe. It was as if the entity was trying to crush us with its presence. Elizabeth, exhausted and bleeding, looked at me with eyes full of fear and pain. I knew I had to do something, but I felt powerless. The negative energy was almost palpable, making it difficult to think. Elizabeth was clearly on the verge of collapse, and I couldn't let her succumb to the terror that surrounded us. We had to keep fighting, but the doubt and fear were almost unbearable. I knew that the entity wouldn't leave us alone easily. With each passing moment, the situation seemed more desperate. The shadows around us moved menacingly, and the sense of imminent danger was overwhelming. Elizabeth began to breathe heavily, and her movements became more erratic. I knew we were racing against time, and any mistake could be fatal. Finally, Elizabeth collapsed from exhaustion, her body still trembling. The entity's presence seemed to withdraw a little, but I knew that this was only temporary. We needed a definitive solution, something that could rid us of the entity once and for all. But at that moment, I felt completely lost and powerless. The night seemed endless, and the terror we felt was overwhelming. We knew that the fight was far from over, and that we needed all our strength and courage to face what was to come. Elizabeth was on the verge of collapse, and I didn't know how much longer we could hold out. Elizabeth woke up, panting and sweaty, but with a look of determination. In a rare moment of lucidity, she begged me to finish the ritual. Her voice was weak, but there was an urgency that couldn't be ignored. We knew this was our last chance. We had to expel the entity once and for all, or it would destroy us. I mustered up all the courage I had and began to read the final words of the ritual from the occult book. Elizabeth sat on the bed, clutching my hands as I firmly recited the words. The atmosphere in the room began to vibrate with an invisible force, almost shattering the reality around us. The shadows stirred violently, as if they were fighting against our attempt to break free. The feeling of dread was overwhelming, but we couldn't stop. I could feel the negative energy building up, making the air even denser and more suffocating. Elizabeth was trembling, her eyes full of fear, but determined to resist. I continued reciting the words, feeling the presence of the entity becoming more and more aggressive. Suddenly, Elizabeth fell into a state of calm. Her breathing stabilized, and the shadows around us began to slowly dissipate. It seemed that the entity was being expelled, and for a brief moment, I felt a surge of hope. Perhaps we had succeeded, perhaps the ritual was working. But as I helped Elizabeth to her feet, I noticed that her eyes were still not normal. There was a strange darkness in them, something that made me uneasy. Before I could say anything, a low, sinister laugh echoed through the room. It wasn't Elizabeth's voice, but something much deeper and more evil. The entity was still there somehow. The feeling of relief was quickly replaced by a new terror. I realized that although the ritual had weakened the entity, it hadn't completely eliminated it. It was as if we had only scratched the surface of the evil that surrounded us. The night was far from over, and the real horror was yet to come. The atmosphere in the room was still charged, and the presence of the entity was undeniable. It felt like we were in a temporary truce, a pause before the next wave of terror. Elizabeth was exhausted, her eyes empty and full of fear. We knew the fight wasn't over yet, and that we needed all our strength to face what was to come. The feeling of imminent danger didn't go away, and I knew that any mistake could be fatal. The real battle was just beginning, and we were about to face the biggest challenge of our lives. I helped Elizabeth to her feet, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. Her eyes, still tinged with darkness, reflected the torment she was facing. The sinister laughter that had echoed through the room still hung in the air, a constant reminder that the danger had not passed. We sat on the edge of the bed, both exhausted and confused. Elizabeth seemed to be in a state of shock, and I knew we needed a plan, something that could help us understand what was really going on. However, fear and exhaustion made it difficult to think clearly. As we tried to catch our breath, the feeling of being watched came back full force. I looked around the room but could see nothing but moving shadows. The entity's presence was almost palpable, and I knew we were under constant surveillance. Suddenly, Elizabeth grabbed my arm tightly. Her eyes were wide, and she whispered that the entity was still inside her. The low, sinister laughter we heard earlier echoed through the room again, and Elizabeth began to shake uncontrollably. The entity was toying with us, making it clear that any attempt to break free would be futile. The feeling of despair was overwhelming. I didn't know what else to do, and Elizabeth was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. It seemed that all our attempts to expel the demon had only made the entity stronger. The atmosphere in the room became even more suffocating, and the feeling of imminent danger was constant. Elizabeth tried to speak, but her words were swallowed up by an invisible force. The entity's laughter was like an incessant ringing in our ears, a reminder that we were at the mercy of something much more powerful than we could imagine. The night seemed endless. Every second that passed, the feeling of desperation grew. We knew we had nowhere to run, that the entity was determined to torment us to the end. Elizabeth and I were trapped in an endless cycle of terror and despair. The last thing I remember is Elizabeth falling to the ground, exhausted and without the strength to continue fighting. The entity's sinister laughter echoed through the room once again, and darkness finally enveloped us completely. And so, on that hellish night in the Canterbury Motel, I discovered that there are things that should never be invoked. True evil was always there, lurking, ready to consume our souls. And in the end, I realized that the purest and most inexplicable terror can be closer than we imagine, just waiting for the right moment to manifest itself.